The 5-year-old girl clutched Garrett Vance's oil-stained sleeve in the crowded VIP lounge of Avonhurst Executive Airfield, her small hands shaking violently. "Please don't let go," she whispered, her voice cracking with a terrifying, ragged wheeze. "You feel like the safe place. You smell like the sky." Garrett Vance froze. He had never seen this child before in his life. Across the polished white marble floor, Vivian Sterling, the formidable CEO of Thorn Aerospace Consortium, strode toward him. Her designer heels clicked against the stone with the cold, lethal rhythm of a woman who commanded global corporate empires and tolerated zero interference. "Security!" Vivian barked, her eyes flashing with pure ice as she looked down at Garrett's faded canvas uniform and grease-smeared boots. "Remove this mechanic from the terminal immediately. He is touching my daughter." But the little girl only gripped tighter, burying her face into Garrett's heavy work trousers, sobbing with a desperation that sent a quiet shockwave through the watching crowd of high-profile executives and elite travelers. Audrey, the daughter of the most powerful woman in the aerospace industry, was refusing to let go of a man who made $20 an hour. And in that tense, suffocating silence, the first thread of a deeply buried secret began to unravel. Garrett Vance was 34 years old, a man who possessed the kind of broad-shouldered, quiet presence that naturally anchored a room without ever asking for attention. For the past 2 years, he had lived as an invisible ghost in the background of Silver Ridge, Colorado. To the elite clients who flew their multi-million-dollar private airframes into the airfield, he was just a nameless technician, a guy in a stained jumpsuit paid to fix faulty environmental valves, bleed hydraulic lines, and stay out of sight. No one in this glittering terminal knew that Garrett held an advanced degree in aerospace engineering, or that he had spent a decade operating in high-pressure military environments so classified that their coordinates did not exist on public maps. They only saw a quiet, stoic, single father who drove a battered Ford truck, packed a neat metal lunchbox every morning, and spent his evenings patiently braiding his 5-year-old daughter Chloe's hair in a small, rented cottage near the foothills. Ever since his wife Eleanor had passed away in a sudden medical crisis 4 years ago, Garrett had stripped all ambition from his life. His world began and ended with Chloe. Nothing else mattered. He didn't care about corporate prestige, and he certainly didn't care about the arrogant, dismissive glances of the billionaires he served. He had mastered the art of being completely, safely unseen. Until this exact moment. Audrey, Vivienne Sterling's daughter, was in the middle of a severe, panic-induced asthma attack. The corporate executives surrounding the powerful CEO were shouting, pulling out cell phones, and freezing in absolute chaos. Vivienne herself, usually an unshakable, terrifying force in the boardroom, looked entirely helpless. Her hands trembled so badly she had dropped her child's rescue inhaler, her eyes wide with a rare, terrifying vulnerability. She was a woman who owned fleets of aircraft, yet she could not buy her own child a single breath of air. But while the wealthy crowd panicked, Garrett Vance became perfectly steady. He did not pull away from the crying child. Instead, he knelt down on the cold marble floor, completely ignoring the advancing security guards who were reaching for their batons. He gently placed his large, calloused hand on Audrey's back, rubbing slow, deliberate circles that radiated an intense, grounding warmth. "Look at me, sweetheart," Garrett said. His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a deep, resonant calm that cut right through the panic in the terminal. "Match my breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Slow down. I've got you. You're completely safe." Instantly, Audrey's frantic gasping began to ease. She looked into Garrett's steady, warm eyes and found an absolute sense of security that she hadn't felt since her own father had disappeared years ago. The child trusted him instantly, her small fingers anchoring deep into his uniform. Vivienne Sterling watched in stunned silence, her breath catching as she saw her fiercely guarded daughter completely soothed under the touch of a stranger. But her fierce corporate pride quickly overrode her shock. Stepping forward, she sharply pulled Audrey away, glaring down at Garrett with deep, venomous condescension. "Do not touch my daughter again," Vivienne said, her voice dripping with absolute authority. "You are a low-level mechanic. You have no right to interfere with my family or touch a child in this terminal. Hand over your airfield credentials. You are terminated from Avonhurst Airfield, effective immediately. Get out of my sight." The VIP lounge went dead silent. Dozens of elite onlookers watched the humble single father suffer a brutal public humiliation. Garrett didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He slowly stood up to his full height, his expression entirely unbothered by her wealth or her rage. He calmly reached into his breast pocket to retrieve his security badge. But as he pulled the badge out, a small, heavy object slipped from his pocket and hit the polished floor with a sharp metallic ring. It rolled across the marble, stopping right at the feet of an elderly, highly decorated military officer standing near the back of the crowd. The old officer, General Thaddeus Briggs, looked down at the object. The moment his eyes landed on the deeply engraved, solid titanium pilot's token, his face drained of all color, and his hands began to shake. General Thaddeus Briggs took a slow, heavy step forward, his polished leather boots clicking against the marble floor with military precision. He ignored the frantic corporate executives and the murmuring crowd, his gaze locked entirely on the small, heavy object resting near his feet. The old officer bent down, his weathered, scarred fingers reaching for the solid titanium pilot's token. He turned it over in his palm, his eyes widening as he caught sight of the deeply engraved, top-secret stealth squadron crest etched into the metal. The general's face drained of color, his chest tightening as he looked up from the token directly into Garrett Vance's eyes. Briggs opened his mouth, a name forming on his lips, a legendary name that had not been spoken aloud in the aviation world for nearly a decade. But before the general could utter a single syllable, Garrett gave him a look. It was a sharp, almost imperceptible shake of the head, paired with a sudden, intense command in his eyes that only a fellow operator would recognize. It was the gaze of a man ordering a subordinate to stand down. The sheer authority radiating from the humble mechanic stopped the highly decorated military official dead in his tracks. Garrett stepped forward, smoothly taking the titanium token from the general's trembling hand and sliding it deep into his pocket alongside his revoked security badge. Vivian Sterling's sharp, clinical voice shattered the brief, heavy hesitation. "Well, are you still here?" She stood with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her emerald eyes fixed on Garrett with a toxic blend of corporate disgust and elite entitlement. "Hand your credentials to the guard and vacate the property immediately. Avonhurst Executive Airfield has no room for low-level laborers who overstep their bounds and touch family members of my executives." Garrett didn't flinch. He didn't offer a defense, and he didn't raise his voice to match her venom. Instead, he looked at the powerful CEO with a profound, steady pity that caught her completely off guard. It was an expression that infuriated Vivian more than any shouted insult ever could. He then knelt down one last time, looking at little Audrey, whose breathing had finally stabilized into a smooth, even rhythm. "Keep matching the sky, little warrior," Garrett whispered softly to the girl, giving her a gentle, reassuring nod. "You're going to be just fine." Audrey reluctantly let go of his sleeve, her tear-stained face filled with a quiet, heartbreaking sorrow as she watched him stand up. Garrett picked up his heavy steel toolbox and his dented metal lunchbox, turned on his heel, and walked away. He moved through the glittering glass terminal with the absolute, unshakable dignity of a king, completely unbothered by the fact that he had just been publicly stripped of his livelihood. The heavy automatic glass doors slid shut behind him, cutting off the whispers of the elite travelers. Inside the lounge, General Briggs remained frozen, his eyes glued to the exit. Vivian noticed the older man's rigid posture and frowned, smoothing down the lapels of her tailored designer blazer to regain her icy composure. "General Briggs?" she asked, her voice carrying a rare trace of uncertainty. "Is something wrong? Did that mechanic disrupt you?" Briggs slowly turned to look at Vivian, his expression a chilling mixture of disbelief and tightly reined anger. "Vivian," the general said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper that made the surrounding executives strain to hear. "You are a brilliant CEO, but today, your pride made you a fool. You have absolutely no idea who you just threw out of this building." Before she could demand an explanation, the general turned and walked briskly toward the exit, leaving the powerful woman standing alone under the vaulted ceilings of the terminal, a sudden, cold prickle of unease tightening across her shoulders. Within minutes, the private medical team Vivian had summoned rushed into the lounge with portable oxygen monitors and advanced diagnostic equipment. But Audrey pushed the specialized nurses away, her small face twisting into a stubborn, defiant frown. "I don't want them," the little girl cried, her eyes darting frantically toward the glass doors where Garrett had vanished. "I want the safe man. Mom, he had the silver token." The exact same one from Daddy's old flight pictures in the study. Vivian stiffened, the breath catching sharply in her throat. The unexpected reference to her late husband, a legendary experimental test pilot who had vanished in a classified aviation accident 5 years ago, struck her like a physical blow. Her husband had belonged to a ghost squadron of elite military pilots, men who carried custom-engineered titanium tokens that were never supposed to leave their possession. She had searched for his token for half a decade, but it had never been recovered from the wreckage. A heavy, suffocating suspicion began to take root in her chest. She pulled out her encrypted smartphone and immediately dialed her chief of corporate intelligence, a ruthless, highly efficient investigator named Harrison Croft. "Harrison," Vivian commanded, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to keep it locked down. "I need a complete, absolute sweep on a maintenance technician named Garrett Vance. He works the morning shift at Avonhurst. I don't want a standard employee screening. I want his taxes, his past employment, his military records, every flight log he has ever touched. I want it on my desk within the hour." Miles away from the high-stakes panic of the airfield, Garrett pulled his rusted Ford truck into the gravel driveway of a small, weathered cottage nestled against the whispering pine trees of Silver Ridge. The engine died with a low, familiar rumble. He sat in the cabin for a long moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel, letting the quiet peace of the mountains wash away the toxic arrogance of the terminal. He was a father first. The rest of the world could burn. He stepped inside the house, the familiar, comforting scent of cedar and dried lavender greeting him. Before he could even set his lunchbox on the kitchen counter, a whirlwind of blonde curls and bright laughter threw itself against his legs. "Daddy, you're home early." 5-year-old Chloe squealed, burying her face into his side, exactly the way Audrey had done hours before. Garrett instantly melted. The stoic, unreadable mask he wore for the world completely dissolved. He scooped his daughter up into his massive arms, lifting her high into the air until she giggled uncontrollably, her small hands resting flat against his cheeks. "Hey there, my little bird," Garrett murmured, his voice thick with a profound, fierce tenderness. "I finished my work early today. How about we go look at the mountain trails?" As he held his daughter close, feeling the steady, healthy rhythm of her heart against his chest, his mind briefly drifted back to the terrified little girl in the terminal. He knew Vivian Sterling would look into him. He knew dropping that token was a critical error that jeopardized the quiet anonymity he had built to protect Chloe. But as he looked at his daughter's radiant, innocent smile, he resolved to guard this simple life at any cost. An hour later, back at the majestic downtown headquarters of Thorn Aerospace Consortium, Vivian sat in her sprawling penthouse office, staring out over the mountain skyline. The heavy oak door clicked open, and Harrison Croft stepped inside. His face was unusually pale, and he held a single, completely empty manila folder. Vivian frowned, her commanding, icy demeanor returning. "Where is the report, Harrison?" "I told you I wanted everything on Vance." Harrison swallowed hard, setting the blank folder down on her mahogany desk with a shaking hand. "That's the problem, ma'am. There is no report. The moment my team tried to bypass the basic employment records for Garrett Vance, our corporate servers were hit with a level 1 federal lockdown. His entire history before 4 years ago doesn't just look classified, Vivian. It has been systematically erased by the highest levels of the Department of Defense. If we trace his digital footprint even one step further, a federal warrant will be issued for our arrest. Who on earth did you fire today?" The rain began to fall in heavy, rhythmic sheets against the vaulted glass roof of the Silver Ridge Aviation Heritage Center. It was the evening of the annual Mountain Charity Gala, a high society event heavily sponsored by Thorn Aerospace Consortium. Garrett Vance had not planned on being anywhere near the elite crowd tonight, but his old military friend, the aging curator of the Heritage Center, Silas Fletcher, had called Garrett in a panic an hour prior. A vintage hydraulic display for the historical flight simulators had locked up, threatening to ruin the interactive portion of the evening for the wealthy donors. Garrett, unable to turn down an old friend who frequently helped watch Chloe, had slipped into the back entrance of the hangar, wearing a clean but faded flannel shirt and dark jeans. 5-year-old Chloe walked beside him, her small hand safely tucked into his large palm as she stared wide-eyed at the towering historical aircraft. "You see that one, Daddy?" Chloe whispered, pointing her small finger toward a polished twin-engine propeller plane from the 1950s. "That looks like the one in your drawing book." "It's close, little bird," Garrett said, his voice a low, soothing rumble in the vast, echoing hangar. "That one was built for endurance. It doesn't fly fast, but it never gives up on you." Across the sprawling, decorated hangar floor, surrounded by ice sculptures and high-ranking corporate board members, Vivian Sterling stood like an ice sculpture herself. She held a glass of champagne she hadn't touched, her mind completely consumed by the terrifying security report Harrison Croft had delivered earlier. Her late husband's history was tied to a ghost that the United States government refused to acknowledge, and the only key to that mystery was currently working as a fired mechanic. Audrey sat on a velvet bench nearby, looking pale and thoroughly exhausted by the suffocating formality of the corporate crowd. She wasn't paying attention to the speeches or the classical string quartet. Her eyes wandered aimlessly through the sea of tuxedos and evening gowns until they suddenly locked onto a tall, broad-shouldered figure standing in the shadows of the vintage aircraft display. Instantly, the little girl's face lit up with a brilliant, radiant warmth. "The safe man," Audrey gasped, completely ignoring her mother's strict etiquette rules. She scrambled off the bench and darted past two stunned Thorne Aerospace executives, her polished patent leather shoes clicking wildly across the floor. "Audrey, stop!" Vivian called out, her highly controlled public persona fracturing for a fraction of a second as she rushed after her daughter. The sudden commotion drew the attention of the entire gala. Dozens of wealthy donors and city officials turned their heads, watching in utter bewilderment as the billionaire heiress of Thorne Aerospace ran full speed toward a man in denim and flannel. Audrey didn't hesitate. She threw her arms completely around Garrett's leg, burying her face into his side with the exact same desperate certainty she had shown at the airfield terminal. "You came back," Audrey whispered, her small shoulders shaking with relief. "I told Mom you wouldn't leave the sky." Garrett immediately knelt down, completely unbothered by the hundreds of judgmental eyes now locking onto him. He offered Audrey a gentle, reassuring smile, his massive hand providing a steady, grounding weight on her shoulder. "Hey there, little warrior. You breathing okay tonight?" She nodded quickly, her grip tightening. Chloe stepped closer to her father, her bright blue eyes shifting between Audrey and the elegant, intimidating woman who was now marching toward them. Vivian arrived with a storm of furious authority radiating from her every step. Her elite board members followed closely behind, their expressions filled with deep disdain for the poorly dressed intruder. "Mr. Vance," Vivian said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, freezing whisper that commanded absolute silence from the surrounding crowd. "I explicitly told you to stay away from my family. Tracking us to a private corporate event crosses a line that my legal team will ensure you regret." Garrett slowly stood up to his full height. He didn't flinch under her intense glare, nor did he look intimidated by the wealthy executives flanking her. His quiet masculinity held the space with a calm, unshakable strength that made the corporate elite look small by comparison. "I didn't track you, Mrs. Sterling," Garrett said softly, his voice perfectly steady. "Silas Fletcher asked me to look at a faulty hydraulic valve in the back. I was just leaving." "Don't talk to my daddy like that." Chloe suddenly interjected, her small voice fierce and fiercely protective as she stepped in front of Garrett's boots, staring up at the powerful CEO without a single ounce of fear. "My daddy is a good man. He fixes things." Vivian looked down at Chloe, and for a fleeting second, her cold corporate armor completely cracked. She saw the absolute unyielding love and security in the little girl's eyes, a sense of peace that money could never buy, a peace her own daughter was desperately starving for. One of Vivian's lead board members, a pompous executive named Carlton Montgomery, stepped forward, his expression twisted in disgust. "Security, remove this vagrant and his child immediately. They are disrupting a premium donor event." Garrett looked directly past Carlton, his eyes locking solely onto Vivian. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating, until Garrett took a single step closer. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small handwritten string of maintenance coordinates, numbers he had pulled from the airfield archives regarding Julian's final flight logs. "The horizon doesn't bleed, Vivian," Garrett said, his voice dropping so low only she could hear it. "That was the last tactical transmission Julian made before the primary thruster housing failed 5 years ago. He wasn't reckless. He was sabotaged. And the men who did it are currently sitting on your board of directors." Vivian's eyes went completely wide, her breath catching sharply in her throat as her hands began to tremble violently. That transmission was classified above top secret. It had never been released to the public, not even to her. Before she could speak, a deafening, thunderous roar shattered the glass windows of the hangar. The emergency lights suddenly flashed red, and the massive mechanical hangar doors began to slowly grind open, letting in a violent blast of wind and rain. Outside on the tarmac, a matte black military transport helicopter touched down, its high-powered searchlights blinding the panicked crowd inside. Heavily armed federal tactical agents stepped out into the rain, moving toward the hangar with lethal speed, and the lead commander held a digital warrant bearing a single name, Garrett Vance. The blinding searchlights of the massive tactical transport helicopter swept across the frightened faces of Silver Ridge's elite, casting long, frantic shadows against the hangar walls. Carlton Montgomery took a triumphant step forward, a cruel, mocking smirk cutting through his aristocratic features. He glanced at Vivienne, then back at the heavily armed federal operators who were rushing into the dry sanctuary of the hangar, their boots splashing through puddles of rainwater. "Well, well," Carlton sneered, his loud voice easily echoing over the howling mountain wind. "It seems our humble line mechanic isn't just an arrogant trespasser. He's a federal fugitive." "Vivienne, this is the exact kind of dangerous trash you allowed near your daughter. Security, assist these marshals immediately. Throw this fraud to the concrete floor." The wealthy onlookers murmured in deep disgust, instinctively stepping back from Garrett Vance as if his faded flannel shirt were contagious. High society women pulled their silk evening dresses away from him, and men whispered venomous judgments about a low-level worker who would dare bring his child into a life of crime. The public humiliation was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. Chloe Vance clung tightly to her father's leg, her tiny frame trembling against the fierce draft blowing through the wide-open hangar doors. Audrey Sterling, escaping her mother's protective grip once more, stood defiantly right beside them, her small fists clenched as she glared at the sneering executives. Commander Dominic Mercer walked past the scattering billionaires, his combat gear clanking heavily with every step. He didn't look at Carlton Montgomery. He didn't look at the beautiful, frozen form of Vivienne Sterling. His sharp, disciplined eyes were fixed entirely on Garrett. He stopped exactly 3 paces away, brought his boots together, and snapped his hand up into a rigid, crisp military salute. The entire hangar went dead silent. The triumphant sneer on Carlton's face completely froze. "Sir," Commander Mercer said, his voice carrying the iron weight of absolute military deference, "we didn't think we would find you in time. The Pentagon issued an emergency Level 1 activation order 20 minutes ago. We need you, Ghost Leader." Garrett didn't return the salute. He remained standing like an unshakable stone pillar, his massive shoulders sheltering both little girls behind his broad frame. "I told the department I was completely done, Dominic, 4 years ago. I have a daughter to raise now. My activation codes are dead." "They were reactivated by presidential decree 10 minutes ago, sir," Mercer replied, his face grim under the flashing red emergency lights of the hangar. He held out a rugged, military-grade tactical tablet. On the screen, a live telemetry feed showed a high-altitude aircraft spinning violently through the mountain superstorm just 30 miles north of their position. The Stratos X global transport, carrying the Deputy Secretary of Defense and 4 of Thorn Aerospace's top structural engineers, just suffered a catastrophic dual-engine flameout. The automatic fire suppression lines have completely ruptured, and the primary flight computer has locked the pilots out of the manual override terminal. Vivienne Sterling gasps, her hand flying to her mouth as her champagne glass shattered against the floor. The Stratos X was her company's flagship experimental vessel. It was supposed to be an uncrashable, multi-billion-dollar prototype, currently carrying her executive board members and vital government liaisons. "The automated atmospheric seal is crushing the internal cabin pressure," Mercer continued urgently, ignoring the gasping corporate crowd. "The pilots have less than 12 minutes of oxygen left before the entire crew loses consciousness. The system architecture of that experimental craft belongs to you, Colonel Vance. You designed the original failsafe. Nobody else alive knows how to bypass a hardwired terminal lock from a ground station." Carlton Montgomery stammers, his face turning into a pale mask of sweating panic. This is absolute madness. He's a line mechanic. A common laborer who greases gears and bleeds brake lines. You're trusting a critical national security asset to a rogue airfield worker? Commander Mercer turned a freezing, lethal glare onto Carlton. "Shut your mouth. This man is the former chief of advanced propulsion at DARPA and a legendary combat rescue pilot. If he doesn't take the stick of a remote uplink station in the next 10 minutes, 6 people die, and your billion-dollar prototype vaporizes into the sheer rock face of Mount Lincoln." The revelation hit the hangar like a physical detonation. The very same billionaires who had just sneered at Garrett's clothes now looked at him with wide-eyed terror and profound reverence. Vivian stood entirely paralyzed, her mind racing at a frantic speed. The man she had brutally fired hours ago, the man she had dismissed as an insignificant laborer, was the hidden genius who had literally built the technological foundations of her global aerospace empire. But Garrett didn't look at the stunned crowd. He didn't care about their sudden awe or their desperate pleading eyes. He knelt down in front of Chloe, his expression shifting into a fierce, absolute devotion. "Daddy?" Chloe whispered, her small voice trembling as she reached out to touch his cheek. "Do you have to go save the people in the sky?" Garrett offered her a warm, incredibly steady smile. "I need to help them, my little bird. But I need you to stay here and be brave for me. Can you do that for your daddy?" Chloe nodded bravely, wiping a single tear from her cheek. "I can be brave, Daddy. Just like the flight drawings in our book." Garrett stood back up to his full height, the humble mechanic completely vanishing. In his place stood an elite commander, a military legend who commanded the entire room without saying a single word. He turned his eyes toward Vivienne, his gaze completely unreadable. "Keep my daughter safe, Vivienne," Garrett commanded, his voice dropping into a low, authoritative baritone that left absolutely zero room for refusal. "If a single hair on her head is touched while I am out there, Thorn Aerospace won't survive the fallout of what happens next." Vivienne quickly stepped forward, her hands trembling as she gently pulled Chloe toward her chest, holding her tightly alongside Audrey. "I swear it on my life, Garrett, just save them. Go." Garrett turned on his heel and sprinted out into the pouring rain toward the roaring military helicopter, Mercer running right at his flank. But just as Garrett's boot hit the transport's boarding ramp, the digital tablet in Mercer's hand flashed a bright, violent purple warning code. The live telemetry feed from the dying aircraft suddenly revealed a second, hidden transponder signal shadowing the falling plane, a signal matching the exact, highly classified stealth signature of the phantom vehicle that had run Julian Sterling off the mountain road 5 years ago. The matte black tactical helicopter roared as it ripped away from the concrete tarmac, clawing its way upward into the black, violent heart of the mountain superstorm. Inside the vibrating command cabin, the air smelled of ozone, sweat, and high-voltage electronics. Garrett Vance strapped himself into the primary observer seat, his broad frame completely unbothered by the violent turbulence that had the other federal operators gripping their safety harnesses. Commander Dominic Mercer slid a heavy, military-grade communications headset over Garrett's ears. "We've established a secure, two-way audio patch directly to the main terminal inside the Avonhurst hangar, sir," Mercer yelled over the deafening whine of the rotor blades. "General Briggs and Mrs. Sterling are on the line. They are watching the live telemetry from the ground." Garrett pulled the tactical tablet closer, his large, calloused fingers flying across the encrypted interface with a terrifying, fluid precision that completely contradicted his humble mechanic persona. His eyes narrowed as he focused on the bright purple blip pulsing on the screen, the ghost transponder signal, shadowing the doomed Stratos X transport. "Talk to me, Dominic," Garrett commanded, his voice dropping into that low, authoritative baritone that instantly stabilized the frantic energy inside the cabin. "That ghost signature isn't a glitch. I'd recognize that frequency sweep anywhere. It's a localized, military-grade jamming pulse." "It's the Apex protocol, sir," Mercer replied, his face pale under the harsh green glow of the tactical monitors. "The exact same classified override architecture that disappeared from the DARPA servers 5 years ago, right before Colonel Julian Sterling's fatal crash." 30 miles away, back inside the brightly lit sanctuary of the Heritage Center hangar, the atmosphere was suffocating. The elite corporate crowd stood completely paralyzed, their wealthy, privileged lives reduced to terrified silence, as Garrett's calm, steady voice echoed clearly through the base command speakers. Vivian Sterling stood in the center of the room, her elegant designer dress completely forgotten. Her hands shook so violently that she had to press them against her sides to hide the tremor. She was holding Chloe Vance's small hand with her left, and Audrey's with her right. "Look at the screen, Mom," Audrey whispered, her voice surprisingly steady as she pointed toward the massive projection wall showing the falling plane. "The safe man is up there. He's going to fix the sky." Vivian looked down at Chloe. The 5-year-old daughter of the man she had just publicly degraded wasn't crying. She wasn't panicking. Chloe looked up at Vivian with bright, trusting blue eyes. "My daddy doesn't let things stay broken, Mrs. Sterling," the little girl said softly, her small voice radiating an absolute, unshakable peace. "He promised he'd come back for me. He always keeps his promises." A wave of profound, agonizing guilt washed over Vivienne. She had spent millions of dollars building an empire of steel and glass, yet in the face of absolute disaster, she had zero control. This little girl, raised in a drafty rented cottage by a man who wore grease-stained boots, possessed an inner security that money could never buy. Suddenly, Carlton Montgomery stepped out of the shadows of the executive VIP circle, his face slick with a cold, greasy sweat. He pulled his smartphone from his tailored tuxedo jacket, his fingers twitching as he desperately tried to input an encrypted message. "This is a farce," Carlton shouted, his voice cracking with a frantic artificial bravado. "We are trusting the lives of our board members to an airborne mechanic who talks in riddles. General Briggs, override this immediately. Demand the Air National Guard deploy." "Shut up, Carlton," General Thaddeus Briggs barked, his old, scarred hand resting heavily on his service sidearm as he glared at the trembling executive. "Colonel Vance is currently the only reason that aircraft hasn't already disintegrated into the peak of Mount Lincoln. Watch your step." Over the speakers, Garrett's voice cut through the hangar like a razor blade. "Stratos X, this is Ghost Leader," Garrett said, his tone perfectly flat, projecting an impossible sense of calm to the suffocating crew miles away. "I have your telemetry. The primary computer has locked your manual controls because it thinks your tail assembly has separated. It's a false narrative fed by the shadow vehicle. I am deploying a raw binary patch to your environmental system now." On the screen, the falling transport's altitude readout was plummeting at a terrifying velocity. 24,000 feet. 22,000 feet. The internal cabin pressure was reaching critical failure. "The shadow vehicle is moving," Mercer warned inside the helicopter, his voice rising in panic. "Sir, it's climbing directly above the Stratos X. It's executing a hardline electronic strangulation maneuver. It's completely severing our satellite uplink array. They did this to Julian," Garrett muttered, his eyes locking onto the data streams with an intense, lethal focus. 5 years ago, they forced his pitch torque into a terminal dive using this exact same shadow overlap. They wanted the prototype to crash so they could collect the government insurance liquidation and bury the engine defects. Inside the hangar, Vivienne's breath caught sharply in her throat. Her late husband's crash hadn't been an accident. It had been cold-blooded corporate murder. "Garrett," Vivienne cried out into the open microphone, her voice entirely breaking as tears finally streamed down her face, stripping away every ounce of her cold corporate armor. "Who is doing this? Who has the codes?" "I'm tracing the localized command transmitter now, Vivienne," Garrett's voice echoed back, chillingly calm. "The shadow vehicle isn't being flown by an automated drone. It's being piloted via a secure, high-frequency remote relay link. And the signal isn't coming from a military installation." Garrett's fingers slammed onto the final override key, executing a blind military decryption that tore through the shadow vehicle's firewall. On the massive projection screen inside the hangar, a red diagnostic map suddenly bloomed. A bright, blinking crosshair locked directly onto the exact geographic coordinates of the remote transmitter. The blinking red dot settled precisely in the center of the Silver Ridge Aviation Heritage Center, right where the board of directors was standing. Vivienne turned her head slowly, her eyes wide with a sudden, horrifying comprehension as her gaze locked onto Carlton Montgomery, who was frantically backing toward the heavy emergency exit doors. The red crosshair on the massive projection screen pulsed with a rhythmic, damning light, pinning Carlton Montgomery precisely where he stood. The frantic corporate executive froze, his hand trembling on the brass handle of the heavy emergency exit door. The silence inside the hangar was absolute, heavy enough to drown out the thunderous roaring of the storm outside. Dozens of wealthy donors and high-ranking board members slowly turned their heads, their expressions shifting from utter confusion to profound horror. Carlton's face turned an ugly, mottled gray under the crimson glow of the emergency lights. He slowly pulled his hand away from the door, his chest heaving as he realized every single security camera in the facility had automatically locked onto his position. "Carlton," Vivienne Sterling said, her voice dropping to a horrifying, hollow whisper that carried more weight than a screamed accusation. "You were his best friend. You sat at our dinner table." Montgomery's frantic persona completely snapped. The polished, aristocratic facade melted away, leaving behind a desperate, venomous man backed into a corner. He let out a harsh, unstable laugh, pulling his smartphone out and holding it up like a weapon. "Your husband was a fool, Vivienne," Carlton shouted, his voice cracking with a manic, terrified arrogance. Julian wanted to hand the advanced propulsion patents over to the military for free. He was going to ruin the valuation of Thorn Aerospace. I built this empire alongside him, and I wasn't about to let his childish morals bankrupt my legacy. He glared at the ceiling speakers, his eyes wide with pure hatred. And you arrogant, pathetic line mechanic. You think because you wore a uniform 10 years ago, you can dismantle a multi-billion-dollar corporate acquisition? I have the master encryption key right here on this device. If you attempt to force another bypass, I will command the Shadow Drone to ram the Stratos X directly over the mountain ridge. 6 lives are in my hand, Vance. Inside the roaring tactical helicopter, Garrett Vance didn't blink. He sat perfectly still amid the severe turbulence, his eyes fixed on the streaming purple data lines on his tablet. His large hand remained hovering over the tactical uplink, his expression completely unbothered by Carlton's threats. "Dominic," Garrett said quietly, his voice a freezing current of absolute certainty. "Patch me through to the main hangar audio system. Let him hear me." Commander Mercer flipped a heavy toggle switch on the console. "Done, sir." "You're live across the entire facility. Carlton," Garrett's voice echoed through the hangar, booming with a deep, authoritative masculinity that made the trembling executive step back in instinctual fear. "You made a critical engineering mistake 5 years ago when you stole that DARPA override architecture, and you made an even bigger mistake today." Carlton sneered, his fingers twitching over his phone screen. "I wrote the secondary firewall layers myself, you stupid grease monkey. You can't touch this code." "You didn't write the firewall, Carlton," Garrett replied, his tone chillingly calm, delivered with an impossible, heavy pause. "You bought it from a black market broker who pulled it from a decommissioned server in Germany, but you forgot to check the deep layer kernel signatures. You forgot to look for the author's personal digital watermark." Vivian Sterling's breath caught sharply in her throat. She looked up at the projection screen as Garrett's fingers slammed onto his tablet, executing a 20-digit master command sequence. On the massive hangar wall, the complex encrypted red coding blocking the Stratos X suddenly began to rapidly dissolve, replaced by a massive, gold military emblem showing a roaring griffin clutching an iron wrench. Beneath the emblem, a single text line appeared in bright, unerasable gold letters. "Property of Ghost Leader, Command Terminal 1. Carlton's smartphone suddenly burst into a bright cluster of white sparks, scorching his palm. He screamed, dropping the ruined melting device onto the concrete floor. "The original source code doesn't belong to the government, Carlton," Garrett said, his low baritone resonating with a terrifying power that left the entire crowd breathless. "It belongs to me. I designed it in a bunker 14 years ago before you ever even heard the word aerospace. Your access is permanently revoked." The power reversal was instantaneous and total. Carlton collapsed to his knees, staring blankly at his burned hand as 2 heavily armed facility guards, led by Officer Keith Mitchell, rushed forward, slamming the weeping executive face first into the cold concrete and securing his wrists in heavy steel cuffs. But inside the hangar, the celebration didn't happen. The visual danger on the primary telemetry screen was still escalating. The Stratos X had dropped to a critical altitude of 12,000 feet, its engines completely dead, caught in a blind, unrecoverable spin over the jagged teeth of the mountain peaks. The remote digital patch had unlocked the flight computer, but the physical control surfaces of the aircraft were completely frozen solid due to the extreme atmospheric icing from the superstorm. Vivian Sterling lost all control. The terrifying corporate titan entirely vanished, leaving behind a desperate, weeping mother who could only watch her life's work and her closest friends face absolute destruction. She sank to her knees right there on the polished marble floor, her body trembling violently as she sobbed into her hands. But as the wealthy executives around her froze in helpless panic, a small, warm hand slipped into Vivian's icy palm. Vivian looked up through her tears. 5-year-old Chloe Vance was kneeling right beside her, her bright blue eyes filled with an unshakable, miraculous calm. Chloe offered the powerful billionaire a soft, beautiful smile, squeezing her hand with a protective strength that shouldn't have been possible for a child her age. "Don't cry, Mrs. Sterling," Chloe whispered softly, her small voice radiating a profound, grounding warmth that instantly cut through Vivian's terror. "My daddy is still in the sky. When the storm gets loud, he just gets stronger. He promised he would save them. Look at the lights." Vivian looked back up at the screen, her heart hammering against her ribs. Miles away in the pitch-black sky, Garrett Vance gripped the secondary remote flight joystick inside the tactical helicopter. His muscles tensed under his faded flannel shirt. His jaw clenched so hard a vein throbbed violently along his temple. He wasn't a mechanic anymore, he was a guardian. "Hold on, little bird," Garrett muttered to the storm. He rammed the remote stick forward, executing a desperate, highly illegal aerodynamic maneuver that forced his own tactical helicopter into a vertical dive, plunging directly toward the falling transport plane. But just as the two airframes crossed paths in the blinding lightning, a massive, catastrophic alarm blared inside Garrett's cabin, and the primary rotor assembly above his head let out a horrifying, metallic shriek of pure structural failure. The metal chassis of the tactical helicopter groaned under the extreme aerodynamic pressure as the primary alarms wailed a chorus of absolute structural doom. Red warning lights bathed the interior of the cockpit in a bloody, pulsing glow. Commander Dominic Mercer braced his boots against the bulkheads, his face completely white as he watched the digital readout of their rotor torque drop into the dead zone. "We're losing the main rotor assembly, sir," Mercer shouted, his knuckles turning translucent as he gripped the structural frame. "The crosswinds are ripping the stabilizer apart. We have to abort the remote link and punch out." Garrett Vance did not move a single muscle in retreat. His large hands remained perfectly locked onto the primary control joysticks, his eyes reflecting the rapid, chaotic scroll of warning data on the tablet. Underneath his faded flannel shirt, his shoulders were tense with an unyielding, rigid strength. He didn't look at the alarms. He didn't look at the violent lightning cracking right outside the reinforced cockpit glass. "We don't abort, Dominic," Garrett said, his low voice entirely devoid of panic, cutting through the blaring klaxons with the chilling weight of an absolute command. "The Stratos X is directly underneath us in the cloud layer. If I lose the satellite uplink for even 3 seconds, their flight computers will default back to the locked terminal state. They will drop like a stone." He slammed his heel against the manual emergency floor override, a hidden mechanical valve he knew existed from his early design days at DARPA. The structural shriek inside the cabin suddenly shifted into a deeper, vibrating rumble as he forced a raw hydraulic fluid bypass directly into the failing rotor transmission. "Match the pitch," Garrett muttered to himself, his gaze piercing through the digital display. Miles away, inside the suffocating vacuum of the Silver Ridge Heritage Center, the entire billionaire elite of the state stood paralyzed, their faces upturned toward the massive projection wall. The telemetry screen showed the 2 digital blips, Garrett's tactical helicopter and the multi-billion-dollar Stratos X prototype, converging in a dangerous, suicidal overlap directly above the mountain peaks. Vivian Sterling could barely breathe. She was still on her knees, her immaculate designer wardrobe pressing against the cold concrete floor, her fingers tightly interwoven with Chloe Vance's small, warm hand. She had spent her entire life engineering corporate mergers, commanding thousands of subordinates, and controlling every variable that money could influence. Yet right now, her life, her company, and the survival of her closest executives rested entirely on the quiet integrity of a man she had discarded as human garbage just hours before. "Look," Audrey whispered, her small voice cutting through her mother's silent terror as she pointed a shaking finger at the screen. "The gold lines are moving." On the projection wall, the gold military emblem of the Ghost Leader suddenly flashed 3 times. Garrett's manual bypass had successfully executed across the sky. The frozen atmospheric control surfaces of the Stratos X violently tore through the mountain ice buildup. The primary altitude tracker on the screen stopped its terrifying vertical death drop. 10,000 feet. 11,000 feet. Suddenly, a crackling, static-heavy voice broke through the hangar's main audio system, echoing loudly off the vaulted metal beams. "Silver Ridge Command, this is Captain Landon Pierce aboard the Stratos X," the pilot gasped, his voice thick with ragged exhaustion but carrying an overwhelming wave of relief. "The manual terminal lock has just dissolved. Our flight computers are responsive. The primary engines have achieved successful reignition. We are climbing out of the cell layer to 16,000 feet. We are stable. Repeat, we are completely stable." The hangar exploded into a deafening, chaotic roar of cheers and applause. Wealthy board members wept openly, embracing one another in absolute disbelief. High society women collapsed onto the velvet benches, laughing through tears of sudden, overwhelming relief. General Thaddeus Briggs let out a deep, booming laugh, slamming his heavy fist against the tactical table, his old military eyes bright with profound pride. But Vivian Sterling didn't join the cheering crowd. She remained on her knees, her eyes locked onto the second blip on the screen, the tactical helicopter carrying Garrett Vance. The red structural warning indicator on his craft was still flashing a violent, dangerous purple, showing a rapid, uncontrolled descent toward the lower valley tarmac. Garrett, Vivian, cried into the open microphone, her voice entirely stripped of its former elite armor, trembling with a raw, desperate vulnerability that her employees had never heard before. Garrett, respond. Please, you saved them. Get yourself down. The speaker remained silent for 5 agonizing seconds, filled only with the distant roaring static of the mountain superstorm. Then, the low, steady baritone of the single father returned, perfectly calm, completely unbothered by the miracle he had just performed. We're on the ground, Vivian, Garrett said softly over the air. The transmission is shot, but we executed a controlled auto-rotation landing into the Southern Valley Marsh. Tell Chloe her daddy is coming home for dinner. Vivian closed her eyes, a single heavy sob escaping her throat as she let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 5 long years. She pulled Chloe and Audrey tightly into her arms, burying her face into their small shoulders, her body shaking with an intense emotional release. For the first time in her brilliant, lonely career, Vivian Sterling realized that her vast wealth had bought her absolutely everything except the true, unshakable safety that this humble mechanic provided without even trying. An hour later, the torrential rain began to clear, leaving behind a crisp, mist-shrouded mountain breeze. The massive mechanical hangar doors of the Heritage Center remained wide open as the black tactical transport vehicles arrived from the valley, their tires crunching loudly over the wet gravel. The elite crowd of donors and billionaires formed a long, silent corridor stretching from the tarmac all the way into the center of the hangar floor. No one spoke. No one checked their luxury smartphones. Garrett Vance stepped out from the rear of the lead tactical vehicle. His faded flannel shirt was damp from the rain, his canvas uniform trousers were stained with Dark Valley mud, and his heavy work boots left wet, heavy imprints across the polished stone floor. His heavy steel toolbox was slung over his broad shoulder. As the humble single father walked into the building, the very same crowd that had demanded his public removal hours ago instinctively parted for him like the Red Sea. Billionaires and corporate executives bowed their heads in profound, silent respect as he passed. Vivian Sterling stood at the very end of the corridor. Her hands were trembling slightly as she watched him approach. The cold, intimidating CEO who was feared in every boardroom across the country had entirely vanished. As Garrett stopped exactly 3 paces away, she looked up into his warm, steady eyes, her chest tightening with an emotional chemistry that had grown naturally through the shared crucible of survival. "Thank you," Vivian whispered, her voice cracking slightly as she took a slow step closer to his early broad frame. The distance between her immense wealth and his quiet masculinity completely disappearing in the silent space between them. "I was completely blind, Garrett. I don't even know how to begin to repay what you did tonight." Garrett offered her a small, incredibly gentle smile, his quiet presence instantly grounding her frantic energy. "You don't owe me anything, Vivian," he said softly, his voice a comforting rumble. "I didn't do it for your company. I did it because nobody else should have to look at an empty chair at the dinner table." Before she could answer, a small, vibrant blur of denim and blonde curls tore through the silent crowd. "Daddy!" Chloe screamed, throwing her small arms around Garrett's legs. Garrett instantly dropped his heavy steel toolbox, kneeling down to scoop his daughter up into his massive, protective arms, holding her close against his chest as if the rest of the world didn't exist. Audrey ran right behind her, standing beside Vivian, her small fingers wrapping securely around her mother's hand as she looked at Garrett with absolute admiration. General Thaddeus Briggs stepped forward, his crisp uniform immaculate as he stopped beside the family circle. He looked at Garrett, then turned his stern, commanding gaze onto the remaining members of the Thorn Aerospace Board of Directors. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Briggs announced, his voice carrying the iron authority of the Pentagon, "as of 20 minutes ago, by federal directive, the entire corporate asset structure of Thorn Aerospace is undergoing a national security audit. Carlton Montgomery's shares have been legally seized, and there is only one man qualified to assume the technical chairmanship of this consortium." Vivian looked at Garrett, her emerald eyes bright with a sudden, beautiful realization. But as the crowd began to murmur in shocking surprise, Garrett slowly stood up, keeping Chloe securely anchored against his shoulder, his eyes locking onto Vivian with a profound, unreadable expression that signaled the final unexpected shift of their lives. The stunning announcement from General Briggs rippled through the grand hangar like a physical wave, leaving the assembled elite of Silver Ridge gasping in absolute disbelief. The very same board members who had spent the evening sneering at Garrett Vance's faded flannel shirt and mud-stained boots now stood frozen, their mouths open as they tried to reconcile the image of a common airfield laborer with the newly appointed technical leader of a multi-billion-dollar aerospace empire. Carlton Montgomery, pinned to the cold concrete floor by the tight grip of the security guards, let out a hollow, defeated groan. He looked up at Garrett, his eyes filled with the bitter, agonizing realization that he had completely destroyed his own life, trying to outsmart the very man who had engineered the technological foundation of his wealth. Officer Keith Mitchell hauled the disgraced executive to his feet, leading him out into the clearing mountain night toward a waiting federal transport vehicle. The crowd silently watched him go, a collective shiver of justice passing through the room. Vivian Sterling stood entirely motionless at the center of the floor. Her green eyes were wide, glittering with a profound, overwhelming mixture of shock, reverence, and a deep, rising emotion she could no longer suppress. She looked at the general, then turned her gaze back to Garrett. "Technical chairman?" Vivian whispered, her voice trembling slightly as she stepped closer to his broad, imposing frame. "Garrett, you never told me. You let me stand in that terminal and treat you like an absolute nobody. You let my board members humiliate you. Why?" Garrett slowly adjusted Chloe against his shoulder, his large, steady hand rubbing his daughter's back with that familiar, protective warmth. He looked around the vast hangar, his expression remaining completely unbothered by the sudden, desperate admiration of the wealthy crowd. When he finally looked back at Vivienne, his dark eyes held a deep, quiet intensity that silenced the remaining murmurs in the room. "I didn't come to Avonhurst Airfield to climb a corporate ladder, Vivienne," Garrett said softly, his low baritone carrying a comforting, unshakable calm. "And I didn't care what your board members thought about the dirt on my boots." He took a slow step forward, the distance between his humble world and her immense privilege completely evaporating. "5 years ago, before Julian took that final flight, he called me from the tarmac," Garrett continued, his voice dropping into a low private register, meant only for her. "He knew someone on the board was tampering with the prototype telemetry. He asked me to watch over you and Audrey if the sky ever let him down. He knew how ruthless this world could be, and he knew you'd be fighting a war with sharks who only cared about share prices." Vivian's breath caught sharply in her throat, a fresh wave of tears spilling over her lashes. "You knew Julian? You were his friend?" "I was his wingman in the Ghost Squadron, Vivian," Garrett said quietly, a faint, respectful smile touching the corners of his mouth. "I took the low-level maintenance job at Avonhurst because it was the only way to inspect every single valve, every fuel line, and every engine housing on your fleet without drawing Carlton's attention. I became an invisible ghost in your background because that was the safest place to build a shield around your family. I didn't need a title to keep you safe." A profound, staggering silence settled over the hangar. The realization hit Vivian like a physical blow. The man she had brutally fired, the man she had looked down upon with cold corporate disdain, had spent the last 2 years working in the freezing shadows, enduring her arrogance, solely to fulfill a sacred promise to her late husband. He had been their guardian angel, asking for absolutely nothing in return. General Briggs walked over, placing a heavy, proud hand on Garrett's shoulder. "The Pentagon requires your signature to finalize the transition of Carlton's seized shares, Colonel. The entire technological future of Thorn Aerospace is officially in your hands. What are your orders?" Garrett looked down at Chloe, who was leaning her head against his neck, her bright blue eyes filled with an absolute, unshakable pride in her father. Then he looked at Vivian, noticing the rare, genuine vulnerability in her eyes, the peaceful surrender of a woman who had finally realized she didn't have to carry the weight of the world completely alone. "I'm declining the chairmanship, General," Garrett announced calmly, his voice echoing clearly off the vaulted steel beams. The crowd gasped again, but Garrett simply raised a hand to silence them. "I'm an engineer and a father," Garrett said, looking directly into Vivian's eyes with a profound, unwavering respect. "Vivian built this consortium into a global powerhouse, and she is the only person who belongs in the primary executive seat. I don't belong in a tailored tuxedo sitting in a penthouse boardroom. My place is down here, on the hangar floor, making sure the machines are built right and the skies stay safe for the people we love. I will accept the role of Chief Technical Director, but Vivienne stays the CEO. Vivienne let out a soft, emotional laugh, wiping the tears from her face as an overwhelming sense of peace washed over her. She stepped forward, extending her hand to him, not as a cold, powerful executive making a deal, but as a woman offering her complete, unguarded trust to the only man who had ever truly earned it. "I think that's an excellent arrangement, Director Vance," Vivienne whispered, her hand completely melting into the immense, warm grip of his large palm. Instantly, the entire Heritage Center erupted into a roaring, thunderous standing ovation. The billionaires, the donors, and the military officials cheered with a genuine, heartfelt reverence, the sound echoing out into the clear, rain-washed mountain night. Down on the floor, completely ignoring the applause of the high society crowd, 5-year-old Chloe slid down from her father's arms. Audrey Sterling stepped forward at the exact same moment, her pale face now radiant with a bright, healthy energy. The two little girls instinctively reached out, locking their fingers together in a tight, joyful bond, looking up at their parents with the pure, untainted wisdom that only children possess. "See, Mom?" Audrey said, her small voice full of a beautiful, triumphant certainty. "I told you he was the safe man. He fixed the sky, and now he's staying." Chloe giggled, squeezing Audrey's hand tightly. "My daddy can fix anything, Audrey." Vivienne looked down at the two girls, then looked back up at Garrett. The fierce, intimidating wall she had spent 5 lonely years building around her heart had completely dissolved, replaced by a warm, growing chemistry that promised a beautiful, shared future. They stood side by side at the edge of the hangar, the crisp mountain air blowing softly around them as the stars finally broke through the clearing storm. They had both lost pieces of their lives to the sky, but here, on the solid ground, they had finally found a home.